to today's webinar, which is a series of events being brought to you by the Open Group. We do have a growing calendar of events that we'll be bringing you in 2013, and if you're interested in finding out what we're planning to do in future events, then please do keep an eye on our webinars page, and you can see the URL there where you can find that schedule. Today's webinar is being brought to us by a very active member of the Open Group, Biz Design, and today we're looking at implementing enterprise architecture effectively. I hand over to our speaker, Sven. I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping issues just to keep the event moving forward smoothly. Firstly, please ask questions. This is one of the major objectives of bringing these events to you. And there are ways you can submit a question. You can either write it into the text chat facility, or probably most effectively is actually to write it into the text QA facility. If you write a question in those two text areas, please ask you to address them either to all or all participants. Everyone gets to see all the questions that are being submitted. We will answer questions at the end of the presentation, so please do ask a question. This event is also being fully recorded, so for if any reason you have to leave early, or if you experience any local technical difficulties, then an event recording will be available from tomorrow. And if you've registered for this event, you will get an email with your profile URL where you can access that recording. So if you're ready, perhaps I can ask you to start your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon, for the introduction. I'm switching now to my presentation, so that should be visible right now. Also from my side, a welcome and thank you for joining in this session. Today, I'm going to talk about implementing enterprise architecture effectively. We see that enterprise architecture, or EA, can be a valuable instrument for organizations, but we also see that some organizations struggle to use and to implement EA effectively in their business. So some introductions. Your presenter today. My name is Sven van Dijk. I'm presenting from Boston in Massachusetts today, where the time is around noon, and the weather is a little bit grayish. I'm from the Netherlands. That's actually where I studied business and IT. That's my background at the University of Twente, the Netherlands, and that's also the place where I picked this rather strange accent, if you already maybe hear it or not. My experience is in application consultancy, also business consultancy, and using methodologies and frameworks for business process management, and also enterprise architecture, and that's what I use as well in my current role at Biz Design in North America, where I work as a consultant and I train, for example, in standards like TOGAF, the Open Group's architecture framework, and Archmate. I have experience in various industries, the telecommunications industry, finance, construction, and also utilities industry. Also, introducing the company Biz Design. Design helps building stronger organizations. Biz Design helps organizations make themselves more agile to respond to changes. And we do by offering tools, design tools, modeling tools for various levels of business design, enterprise architecture, business process management. For consultancy, we help organizations design their businesses. But we also help organizations embed business design practices in their organizations. We offer training on various levels, also certification trainings. Our certification trainings are accredited by the Open Group. For example, in TOGAF, the Open Group's architect framework, and also Archimate, the Open Group standard for enterprise architecture modeling. I will elaborate a little bit on these standards a little bit later on in the presentation. Next slide. So Biz Design is a global organization. We have clients and offices. We'll get some examples on the slide. here our headquarters are located in the Netherlands, and we have offices in other countries, Europe, and in North America. We have offices in Toronto as well as in Boston. Okay, so let's get to the meat of the presentation and the subject matter of today's webinar, which is about implementing EA in an effective way. So what we see happening in organizations is there's questions that are not so straightforward to answer. So some examples here, for example, how do we support future that takes advantage of cloud computing, or more general, how do we adopt new technologies in our organization? How do we make sure that we derive value from those new technologies? Or another example, how do we improve and optimize our technology-enabled business processes? And if you zoom in on these questions, then you see that the answers actually to answer these questions, you need an integrated vision on the organization. You need to have an overview of all the domains that are in the organization, and that's where enterprise architecture can help. And if the soul gets merged and there's a lot of these questions that cannot be answered, then maybe the CIO says, okay, well, let's implement enterprise architecture. Let's implement an enterprise architecture practice so that we can better address these questions. And what often happens is that somebody gets appointed as the chief enterprise architect, gets knighted as the chief EA, and so this person is tasked with building an enterprise architecture capability in the organization, and he starts a lot of energy and starts asking around people, and expectations rising, but after a while it's not so clear where exactly to start. You actually have to do to implement enterprise architecture in the organization. So the question can be, so now what? With all the information gathered by the newly appointed chief enterprise architect, it's possible that he doesn't see the forest for the trees anymore. So one of the difficulties with enterprise architecture, or actually one of the challenges with the enterprise architecture, is that there's not really a clear definition of to what enterprise architecture actually is. And one of the pitfalls that organizations can run into is that the enterprise architecture initiative strands in a definition contest. Pitfall, although it is important to have a definition for the organization, at least determine what enterprise architecture is actually going to do in an organization. How is it going to deliver value? The starting for a definition is the one on the slide here, which is from our handbook, Enterprise Architecture, and it defines enterprise architecture as a conceptual tool that can help organizations get a deeper understanding of their structure and the complexities of their organization and the way they work. And this provides a map of the enterprise and can be used as a route planner for business, but also technology, so implementing change in an integrated way. Uses of it are systematic IT planning, so enterprise architecture can give you a structure to plan IT or business change, and also to do enhanced analysis on an integrated way. And the outcomes of this analysis support decision making in general, also in the organization. So this tells us actually that enterprise architecture provides you so fundamental level, enterprise architecture provides you insight in the complexities of your organization, but how you actually use enterprise architecture, that in different organizations use enterprise architecture techniques to improve their business IT, or these enterprise architecture techniques to solve outsourcing questions. So what parts of the business are we going to outsource, and what types of SLAs do we need to configure the vendors? Impact is risk analysis, but also impact of change analysis on an integrated in an integrated way on an enterprise level portfolio management. So the point is that enterprise architecture can be used by organizations in many ways. It can be an effective tool for communication. With the insight that enterprise architecture gives you in the complexities of the organization, you can better communicate to stakeholders what they're supposed to do, for example, when adopting innovation. So enterprise architecture can be an effective tool to adopt innovation in the organization. And all governance is important. Enterprise architecture can set a common set of goals for all the parts of the organization, so that all the activities that are performed by the organization are more in line and more in a coherent way. Again, the point is enterprise architecture can be used by organizations in many ways. On the extremes, we see organizations use enterprise architecture and adopt enterprise architecture from a top-down perspective, using a top-down approach, where enterprise architecture is used to answer strategic questions about how to organize ourselves. On the other hand, we see organizations use enterprise architecture techniques from a bottom-up approach, where enterprise architecture is used to align activities, align projects, and set common goals, and also common process for projects in order to work in a more coherent way, doing goals on an enterprise level. But even more often, it's not an either-or decision. We see elements from a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach being used in organizations. And actually, a little bit more elaboration on typical activities in a top-down, bottom-up approach can be found in the TOGAF, the Open Group's architecture framework specification. TOGAF specifies certain classes of architecture engagement, and we see in the left side of the diagram, we see the top-down approach. So enterprise architecture is used to define required change. On the right-hand side, on the bottom, in purple, we see that enterprise architecture is used to implement change in the organization. So this gives you a little bit more guidance on what typical activities are of enterprise architecture, a top-down perspective and a bottom-up perspective. So we've seen what is architecture can be for an organization, and we also saw that one of the first tasks of this newly appointed chief enterprise architecture is to decide what is the approach that we are going to take in our organization, what is needed in our organizations for enterprise architecture to deliver you. In general, we've seen that EA is a discipline with the objective of steering change, but how does EA actually look like? What is EA in general? What is the ingredients of enterprise architecture? There's actually two things, in my opinion. On one hand side, enterprise architecture is the product, the actual design, the actual blueprint that shows the organization and its complexities, including all the of the organization, the process, the organization, the departments, etc., etc. So that's EA as a product. But on the other hand side, EA is a process that includes the architects and the people involved in actually setting up an enterprise architecture and to keep enterprise architecture processes running, including the roles, the responsibilities, the design and architecture processes, and the governance structures that are part of that. So are the actual things that you need to implement when you start in an EA practice, product process. And to do that, there's again a number of ways to do. Enterprise architecture, there's never one winning approach. Many organizations can use can explore, invent homegrown techniques to do enterprise architecture. For larger organizations, that might be actually a little bit that's work. So there's a lot of tools that organizations can use to in their own organization. There's architecture frameworks. I already mentioned TOGAF, the Open Groups Architecture Framework, already a couple times, but also reference architectures for specific industries, for example, the telecommunications industry. Modeling tools, also modeling techniques, modeling languages, best practices. And if you're going to dive into the area, you see that there's actually a lot out there for organizations to leverage. Already mentioned TOGAF and Archimate a couple of times. We've seen organizations being successful implementing enterprise architecture, actually the two ingredients of enterprise architecture, the process and the product, in terms of the language, using TOGAF, the Open Groups Architecture Framework. Defines the processes, the design processes, the governance processes, etc. that you need, and also for each of the steps, the products that you actually need to create. And in terms of the viewpoints, gives organizations a common language to describe the enterprise architecture. Going to go over TOGAF from a high level. Are the elements of the TOGAF standard. Centrally, there's the ADM, the Architecture Development Methodology. That is the core of the TOGAF standard that actually defines the steps that need to be taken in order to set up enterprise architecture. Supported by guidelines and techniques. Also, TOGAF defines the deliverables that need to be created while doing architecture work, and also the enterprise continuum gives a way to organize the repository. TOGAF also includes reference models and an architecture capability framework, and this part of TOGAF is actually important for implementing enterprise architecture because it specifies what are the roles, what are the responsibilities, how do they interact with departments, with other organizations within the enterprise, and how do governance processes work for enterprise architecture. So the capability framework is an important point of reference when implementing EA based on TOGAF. Archimate and TOGAF, as mentioned before, TOGAF specifies the output that needs to be created in the various phases of ADM. And Archimate provides a language that you can use to create that output in a coherent core of enterprise. The core of Archimate, we see on the right-hand side of this slide, the framework, the Archimate framework, and the core of Archimate is a business application and technology layer that helps you create output in the phases B, C, and D of TOGAF, where you create the business information systems and the technology architecture. But also, Archimate includes a foundation part that can be leveraged to answer strategic questions and implement and migration of Archimate address the later phases E, F, and G of TOGAF. This is just on a high level the tools organizations can use TOGAF and Archimate to implement enterprise architecture. More details on how to use TOGAF and how TOGAF and Archimate together can be used in organizations will be in a webinar that is planned in, I think, the next 2 weeks, where my colleague Ben Gills will elaborate on the details of TOGAF and actually how TOGAF and Archimate work together. So, but once the organizations decide what tools to leverage to implement enterprise architecture in the organization, key is that this is done in the this will be done in the way that delivers the most value for an organization. Tools have been leveraged in the right way. challenges when implementing an enterprise architecture practice in the organization are that enterprise architecture EA impacts many aspects of the organizations. Some businesses EA as a separate department outside the already existing departments in the organization. But in reality, EA needs to be embedded. EA needs to be integrated into existing frameworks in the organization. EA has to deal with many stakeholders, and stakeholders often have different backgrounds. Stakeholders from the business world, but also from an IT world, and EAs have to communicate with these stakeholders in a language that is understood by the stakeholders. The stakeholders have different perspectives and also different expectations as what is the value add of EA for the specific roles. So EA does not operate in isolation, but it really has to be integrated. It really has to be fitted into other processes that are around in the organization, for example, the IT development process or governance processes. And if organizations do not realize that EA really needs to be embedded in the organization rather than set up as a separate entity, then it is very difficult to gain value from EA. Because EA needs to be embedded in the existing organization, the implementation of EA should be regarded as a change project in itself. And often, and especially in larger organizations, implement EA is a longer-term project, which can be several years, even rather than revolution. An initiative needs a long-term vision. So, what is it that we want to achieve the long term? And the road to implement EA in the organization should be broken up into smaller pieces. Pitfalls to the ocean. That is something that we hear often. So, the trick here is really to chop the whole road towards EA implementation into swallowable pieces and use incremental approach. One key aspect of this approach is that that you take in the road to implement the EA practice should be add value by themselves in the context of the longer term vision. And how these steps are prioritized is based on the needs organization and also on the change capacity of the organization. If there's no design and practices or whatever available in the organization at this point in time, then you probably need some more time. So from the practices, from our experience, we drafted this generic approach that you use for EA implementation, and it's broken down into 3 steps. It starts with an aim step, it goes into an establish step, and then in an execute step. And these steps are repeated for each capability increment. The aim phase goals, short-term goals for the current increment should be defined in the context of the longer-term vision of where we be with our enterprise architecture capability on the long term. Also in the aim phase, stakeholders need to be selected and frameworks and tools as well. In the establish phase, tailoring and embedding of the tools and also governance. In the execution phase, it is key to test the newly acquired capability in the organization and also check the performance of the new capability against the goals that were stated in the beginning. short-term goals for the increment that is going to be implemented. What the step is depends on the current and also the desired maturity level of enterprise architecture. What is in place in the current situation? And in practice, we've seen that sometimes there's already more in place than you think. So, beginning, if you ask, so do you enterprise architecture at this point in time? They say no, we do no enterprise architecture at all, and we really need to work on that. We're going to look into the organization. Then there might be already some architecture processes in place. For example, business architecture is done in one place in the organization, and app architecture is done in another part of the organization. So sometimes it's not really matter that it's not there yet, but sometimes it's the quality or the maturity of the current processes. How well are those processes defined right now? Are they formal or informal? And how well are those processes integrated? Do those business architects and those application architects, do they communicate with each other or even know each other? So an element that you can use to assess the maturity of the enterprise architecture is maturity models. There's a number of maturity models being developed specifically for EA practices. TOGAF mentions the A, C, and N model. Another example is the architecture maturity model as developed by MIT. They define architecture maturity in 4 phases. Business silos is first phase. It goes to technology via optimized core to business modularity. And the way how you can use these maturity models to decide where you want to be, but also where you are at this point in time. So, for example, not all organizations have to attain the highest level of business modularity, but they can also be successful with elements of the optimized core. In the established phase, the focus is really on tailoring the frameworks that were selected for this phase. TOGAF, if the organization selects TOGAF as the framework to go with. TOGAF is a generic method. It's designed to create enterprise architecture practices for large, complex organizations in various areas. So, effort is really essential, is needed to make an own organization-specific architecture framework. And the concepts of this architecture framework are based on the intended goals of the organization. So I mentioned earlier the top-down approach or the bottom-up approach. So based on those goals that were chosen, the framework needs to be designed. Also, action with other frameworks need to be designed in an embedding phase. And a lot of guidance is actually given on how to do this tailoring phase. In the preliminary phase, activities are described that organizations have to do to the TOGAF framework to fit it into the own organization. I was talking about embedding as well. TOGAF does not exist in relation in an organization, but it has to be integrated with other frameworks out there. So the core of the TOGAF standard, the architecture development method, has to be integrated with other frameworks. As an example, an organization can already have implemented the Prince2 framework for project management, and also EM has where projects are defined, and these frameworks should be integrated. So we that in a case actually TOGAF implementation is not really always about implementing new process, but it's more under of coordinating existing processes and bring them together. Phase is about I see questions coming along about the audio. I hope that you can really hear your voice. Not sure if you can check this, Simon. I'll get also some confirmation that that the sound is fine. So it will be resolved soon. Execution phase is about piloting and feedback. Organizations select a project or program with enough visibility to test case the newly acquired capability. Measure, make the capability increment measurable, see if the value is really attained. And the outcomes of the piloting phase should be feedback into the overall vision and should be used for the next increment. The projects are going to be planned for the next increments. Are the long-term goals still valid? And is a prioritization that we created from the outset, is that still also communicating of lessons learned? Important aspect. And to make this all a little bit more concrete, let's have a look at a case example. A big telecommunications organization that we as business help to build an enterprise architecture capability. So this was the IT department of a communications organization, several line businesses, wireless, cable, and this organization had decided to adopt the TOGAF standard and the ADM, the architecture development method, to integrate with existing processes. And the approach that we took was that we started with an initial phase that really focused on tailoring the initial processes that were needed in the organization, and we would plan subsequent projects to gradually evolve architecture maturity. Also, we chose a bottom-up approach. So we were in the IT department of this telecommunications organization, and the idea to think eventually we would grow, but start small. This thing that start small has actually two axes: vertical growth, so from an operational level, so from a project perspective, gradually move towards the more strategic level, so that enterprise architecture can move a rather reactive source to a more proactive instrument, but also horizontal growth. We saw various lines of businesses, and we would start within one of the lines of business and gradually expand the scope towards full enterprise. So this we design the initial scope and how we plan the growth for the future. So specific challenges for this organization were the historic separation between the lines of businesses. The landscape was very heterogeneous. There was lots of duplication of functionality, and also a lack of and inequities in the architecture work across the line of businesses, but also across the various domains. There were a number of architecture functions in various domains: business architecture, application architecture, infrastructure architecture, but they all use their own methodologies and their own tools. The engagement model, how architects were involved in actual projects, was not consistent. So we started with formal TOGAF training, identified architects were brought together and received training, and this was a starting point, building a common language for all the architects, all the architects and all the architecture domains. Already the TOGAF training, where people were brought together and where people actually met each other first time, they were already exchanging ideas about what are the standards, what standards are our architectural output and our architectural work can we actually set up and create going forward. So TOGAF training was not only useful to the TOGAF knowledge, but it was already starting point for talking about how we're going to adopt this this framework to make our work better and more valuable for the organization. The next step was to tailor the ADM, select the processes and the inputs and outputs from the TOGAF framework and make them organization specific and integrate those outputs for the technology architecture and for the data architecture and integrate that into one deliverable. And also integration with existing frameworks. And this proved to be very important in that organization from an engagement model point of view, but also a governance point of view. We made that very explicit in this case. We started integrating the architecture framework, the ADM, which in this is on the bottom side of the diagram, where you see all the steps of the ADM, starting with the architecture vision to architecture all the way through implementation governance. And the integration was created with the solutioning process, which was a very important major process in that organization. And the solution process starts with the development of a concept, goes through various iterations and end up in a solution process. And there were various variants. So there was a waterfall process, but also an agile process. So these were these needed to be integrated. The architecture work in the various phases had to be fit into the solutioning process. Let's go to the next slide. So we explicitly defined the added value of enterprise architecture in the various phases of the solutioning process. So already in the beginning of a new solution process, enterprise architecture comes and helps creating a clear vision based on the enterprise architecture in the organization, where they have an integrated view on the existing landscape and an integrated view on the to-be situation. So for each solution process, this knowledge could be leveraged in the development of concept phase. And enterprise architecture would create a deliverable, an architecture vision document with a high-level vision for a solution. Then in the subsequent phases, enterprise architecture would perform gap analysis and in an integrated way. So including this architecture as well as application and technology architecture to for solution come up with an integrated way of gaps that need to be addressed by various projects. And in execution phase, enterprise architecture would govern the proper execution of all those projects and see if they stayed in line with the overall enterprise architecture. The next steps in the project, the new capability was tested in a pilot phase in a program that started, and the feedback out of that pilot phase was used to optimize the organization architecture framework, the organization-specific architecture framework in subsequent phases. So there were some adjustments to the processes, there were new processes added, but also the deliverables themselves were tuned to make them even more valuable in the steps that I just mentioned. And also, subsequent steps were planned to increase the value of enterprise architecture and to prolong that those exercises showed previously to go to a more strategic level by introducing new capabilities such as improved standards management and other governance processes. So this case actually showed that it's really important to create your own framework. TOGAF in itself is very valuable, but making it your own framework, you really make it concrete and specific, and only if an organization is able to do that in the right way, then the framework will actually deliver value and deliver concrete value in the processes. This is only a selection of lessons learned, or actually a lot of lessons there, but one of the most important ones is also the aspect, getting people involved, getting people engaged in building this enterprise architecture. It's not only the group inside, the architects themselves, but also the people that you want to engage, that you want to actually work for, through enterprise architecture for. So there's various ways to do that. Training, we provided total training for the architects, but we also provided tailored training for roles that were involved in the process. For example, C-level, or in case the project managers that execute the solutioning process. Other forums, presentations, newsletters are very important to show what you're doing, and also just socializing is important. Okay, talking so far about implementing enterprise architecture at a rather high level, aim, establish, execute. In the remainder of the presentation, I want to focus on a more concrete, on a more practical level, and show some concrete tools, some practical tools that you can use to implement EA even more effective. So implementing EA is a change project, in a way more value into the EA capability based on the needs of the organization and also the change capacity. And what you need to do in terms of the activities that are involved, the TOF ADM have a standard that gives more detailed guidance. So the TOF ADM actually can be used to implement EA in the organization itself. If you refer to the TOGAF standard and look into section 46, TOGAF actually gives more detailed guidance on what to do in each of the steps, the ADM, to implement an enterprise architecture capability in organization. So implement EA should be managed as a program or a project with effective tooling, and I'll elaborate on a methodology that we've used, which is based on the GRIP approach. So first, as I mentioned, the ADM can be used to implement enterprise architecture in the organization. We see ADM, the architecture development method, here again, and where she talked about the aim phase, we see that steps and activities from the ADM's preliminary and phase A describe activities within the phase. Phases B, C, and D are the phases where you really establish an enterprise architecture capability, and in the execute phase, it's where you implement, tailor, and embed the EA capability in the organization. More specific, here's a summary of specific activities that you do in phase B and A. Phase B and A, preliminary and the vision phase, the vision, stakeholders, and principles are defined. In phase B is about the definition of processes, architecture processes, but so deliverables, what is it that we need to create for our stakeholders. In phase C is about the information systems, what are the tools that we need to do enterprise architecture, for example, modeling tools, but also a database, a holding area for all architecture output. Phase D is about the infrastructure. And phase E, F, and G, enterprise architecture, is actually tailored and embedded in the organization. So the point here is that TOGAF ADM can be used, the steps of the TOGAF ADM can be used to implement enterprise architecture in the organization. Get on change programs and projects. We've been using successfully within BizDesign in these type change programs, for example, implementing EA, using the GRIP approach. So this GRIP is a methodology, a practical methodology that can be used to support change programs. But it's on a project, from a project management perspective, it gives you overview and insight in all the activities that are going on, and also the statuses of those activities. Also, the GRIP approach supports what are the roles and responsibilities. So, who is doing what type of activity, implement the enterprise architecture, and also a governance structure in terms of approvals, etc. So, what does it mean, GRIP? What do we mean by GRIP on of change? It means that at all times you have insight in the current situation and a clear overview of what the activities are that are executed right now, but also the activities that are planned in the future. We're talking here about all the activities and initiatives that gradually add more capability and more maturity to the EA practice. Roles, responsibility, so who is doing what and who's responsible and accountable for what type of activity. And also GRIP gives a coherent way to communicate about progress, so how are we doing, what activities are finished, etc. So this approach that I'm talking about that we use in change programs, for example, for implementing enterprise architecture, is based on balanced scorecards. These balanced scorecards provide a structure for programs, but also ability to design the technique for each of the specific organization. And this approach is supported by tooling, the GRIP manager. Show some examples of how you can use the GRIP approach to implement enterprise architecture. The general structure of the GRIP manager is a GRIP card. This is the balanced scorecard, and all the activities that are identified by the organization to implement EA are grouped in boxes. And each of the items within the boxes can be given a status, and the status can be tracked, which you an overview of the overall status of the at the program level. So here a GRIP card applied to the implementation of enterprise architecture. We see build an enterprise architecture capability as the GRIP card. We see various phases, as explained a couple of ago, the various activities, and we use the AD here as a structure. We start with phase A, going into phase B, and on and on. And so these activities within the phases are grouped in phases. And on this level of detail, there's items, there's the specific activities that need to be done by the organization to implement enterprise architecture. The GRIP approach also supports governance by adding statuses for each of the activities. And this allows the organization to track the progress of EA implementation. All criteria can be defined that have to be met before you actually increase the status of an activity or finalize an activity. Questions can be defined that need to be answered in order to meet criteria. And in a full situation, you could even ask to provide evidence to show that action is really answered. So at work in the tool, we see we zoom here on an activity within phase A, in the phase of building the enterprise architecture capability, where you identify stakeholders, concerns, business requirements, and a vision. And there's on top a vision of what should be achieved in this step. And then on the bottom, you see that there's a number of questions that need to be addressed. In this example, is there already an organization chart of the enterprise architecture capability set up? approach also supports approvals. Each activities can be appointed to a responsible role, and this approval mechanism can be aligned with the governance structure in the organization. Within the enterprise architecture context, we see often a core architecture team, we see lead architects, we see an architecture board. These can be assigned, for example, to a lead architect, and the sub procedure can be assigned to, for example, the governing board, the architecture board. And using this approval mechanism, it is possible to progress, to trace the progress of all the activities. Here we see the same activity again, part of phase A, identification of stakeholders, and we see that this is had several increments and in the end was approved. This progress translates into an overview of the rest itself. This all shows that the various phases and the various activities within these phases are complete for phase A, not starting in phase C and underway in phase B, the application part of phase C. Enterprises, we see that enterprise architecture is implemented on various abstraction levels. This also refers to the top-down approach, where an enterprise starts with EA practice on a strategic level and works its way down to the level of capability. So this further can be supported. So you can see that activities can be run in parallel, because there's a lot of activities involved implementing enterprise architecture at various levels, and they can run in parallel. And by using the GRIP approach to track the progress, an overview can be created of all the various activities and their statuses. I'm almost running out of time, so I'm skipping this slide. A summary of the GRIP approach. The GRIP approach actually makes a implementation very practical, very explicit, and we've seen that we can leverage the GRIP approach to implement and tailor and embed TOGAF in an organization. The GRIP approach provides project management, but also a governance structure where you can find roles and responsibilities. Example, I showed how you can use the GRIP approach to implement enterprise architecture, and also how this process can be governed. And what we see in practice is that the governance approach that you used while implementing enterprise architecture can also be used for all the enterprise architecture projects that you actually do after the EE practice has been established. So, wrapping up the web of this session, implementing enterprise architecture. Effectively, I recognize that we covered a lot of ground here. We start saying that enterprise architecture can give an organization insight into the complexities of their organization that need to respond to change. There's a lot of tools, for example, frameworks and languages, TOGAF and Archimate, that an organization can leverage to implement enterprise architecture in the organization. But from these tools, the business value is not only determined by the tool, but more by the extent in which the organizations can adopt these tools by tailoring and embedding these tools in the right way. The process of implementing EA should be structured and managed, also governed as a change program with iterations leading to EA capability increments on a high level with aim, establish, execute structure on a more detailed level. FPM can be used for detailed guidance on implementing EA. And we've then looked at the GRIP approach that can be used to make enterprise architecture implementation more explicit. More information can be found on our website. There's a blog there where we just started a series of postings on implementing EA roadmap for success, but also other interesting posts and series out there. There's also a number of white papers that can be downloaded from our website on enterprise architecture management, also other topics like business model management. We're in the process of also drafting a white paper for implementing enterprise architecture specifically. Not ready yet, but it will appear there as well. Also interesting could be the EA Quick Start program, which can be downloaded from our website, and this gives organizations a quick introduction into EA tools, TOGAF, Archimate, and how they can use it to quick start, jumpstart actually their EA practices. And there's webinars on the Open Book website. On November 29, my colleague Bess van Gils will talk about the nation of enterprise architecture and Archimate, TOGAF and Archimate, and there's also other recordings available there as well. Thanks very much for attending the session, and maybe we can see if there's any questions at this time.
Well, very much, Sven. It's a very interesting presentation. I know this is one of a series that BizDesign are thankfully bringing to us, so thank you very much for that. We have a couple of questions, but beforehand, I had a few people asking about getting hold of a copy of the slides. What would be the best way to do that, Sven?
A way to do it is to send me an email directly, and then I can provide you with the with myself. My email address is shown right now. So that would be one way.
That's an alternative, everyone. You'll all get a copy of my email address. So if you don't get hold of Sven's email address, please send me an email, and I'll forward it to Sven, and I'm sure Sven will send you a copy of his slides. Also, then someone asked about the handbook. You mentioned about an EA handbook at the beginning of your presentation. How do you hold of that?
That you can contact BizDesign via our website, and that's actually the place where we also offer our EA handbook.
Fantastic. Yeah, I mean, that'd be brilliant. So the website, once again, you've got my email address, and I can always forward that to the appropriate people at BizDesign. So we're running close to the end, but I think we've got a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. So we've got a question here from Matthew Hall, and I'll read it out. He says, in the new world of Agile, we often see that companies can shy away from any position that mentions architecture and implies to them slow, BUP type activities. How does EA fit in with this common perception? What do you think, Sam?
That's actually a very valid remark by Matthew. So thank you for. So in my presentation, I think I mentioned EA and enterprise architecture and framework and methodology maybe 100 times. But I also acknowledge that in some organizations, EA may be not the right word to call to use if you talk about the techniques that we've seen in this presentation. As I, for example, in the data I showed of enterprise architecture, we also say that enterprise architecture techniques can be used, for example, to do systematic IT planning or structured IT planning, integrated IT planning. And sometimes you need to use other words that more fit the context. If you're talking about how, it's more the connotation of quick and fast, while enterprise architecture has more the connotation of rigid and complex. And while acknowledging these connotations, I also see that enterprise architecture really has techniques techniques that make your organization more actually. But you have to use them in the right way, and you have to use them using terminology of the organization itself. So if enterprise architecture is not the word to refer to these techniques, then maybe you should use other words there. So yeah, again, I think this is a very valid remark by Matthew.
Thanks. Well, as I said, we're running on time, so let's just have one more question. I think we can then wrap it up. We've got a question here from Ted Bagasixi asking, is perceived by the majority of CXOs as unnecessary financial burden with IT stepping into business. There is little knowledge in business circles about EA. We convince stakeholders to invest money in implementing EA. I think a very interesting question.
I think it is really an interesting question, and it is actually a question that we run into for a lot of organizations, and it's a little similar to the previous question. So the other connotations of EA is that it's IT. And what I've tried to explain in this presentation as well is that enterprise architecture is integrated framework, and it's not always the case that we have to grow an EA function from IT side of the world. I've also talked about the top-down approach of enterprise architecture, where you really EA as a more strategic instrument. And if you IT in that way, or depending on the approach that you take for EA, you also select the people play an important role in that EA. And if it's business people needed there, or business architects, then you should select those in your team rather than IT specialists. So it really depends on the approach that you take, who has to involve, and it doesn't always have to be IT. And if it's perceived in that way, then it's the task of the enterprise architect or any other role in the organization to make sure that this is understood by the business, that integrated approach, and get into complexities of the organization, because they are really there, can support their decision making, and also make sure that this doesn't necessarily have to come from IT.
That's fair. Well, as I say, we've run over a little bit, but I think that's absolutely fine. I think it would be a convenient moment to wrap up today's session. So once again, get materials, either send Sven a direct email, and his email address is still on the screen. Alternatively, you can send me an email, and you'll all get a copy of my email, an email directly from WebEx tomorrow, and I will happily pass that on to Sven or to Brenda at BizDesign. So once again, thank you very much for attending. Sven, thank you very much for your time, and at this point I'll end the presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.